Welcome, everybody, to Broadcast Team Alpha, where we bring you cutting edge conversations while exploring the quantum possibilities. And I am so excited for our guest tonight because we are going to explore some serious quantum possibilities. You know, there's so much talk now about extraterrestrials and disclosure and I mean, before we were permitted to talk about it, right? Because we were all silent for so long. Did you ever wonder? I mean, did you ever go out at night when you were a little kid and just waiting for something, right? You know they're going to come for you. You're waiting for something. So did it ever occur to you that maybe your ancestry isn't just this ancestry? What about what about public figures? What's their ancestry? And not to be sacrilegious, because this is not at all, but what about Jesus? We're going to take a good look at that tonight. But before we get started, I want to invite you to connect with us at broadcastteamalpha.com. And every Sunday, we have the Mastermind Connection. It's where we meet on Zoom. A bunch of phenomenal, oh my goodness, just phenomenal thought leaders who totally think outside of the box. We get together and we join our most loving, compassionate, and benevolent thoughts together for a specific intention. We have intended to shift weather patterns, which we've had some success at. And of course, we were not the only people doing that. We've intended for situations around COVID. And of course, we intend for health and well-being for everybody and everything on the planet. And it is the most magical afternoon every single Sunday. And you are invited, if you would like to come play with us, to come mastermind with us, just send an email to themastermindconnection@gmail.com. Make sure you put the THE mastermindconnection@gmail.com, and we'll send you the link, and you can see if it's something that you love the way that we love it. And without any further ado, Augie, can you please tell us about our phenomenal guest tonight?
Oh, I definitely will. This is going to be so much fun. We have Paul Anthony Wallis with us, all the way from Australia. And he's well known. He's on conferences and radio shows, TV shows, and he's everywhere on the internet. You probably have seen him, but I'm going to say a few things about him anyway, for those three of you out there that's never heard of him before. And he is a phenomenal guest and a world traveler, a researcher and digger into old records hardly ever seen or heard of by most people. He's an international best-selling author, and his book probe into ancient human history and mythologies that appears to come out as being true. How about that one? He's also a sought-after speaker. He makes video documentaries seen by millions around the world. He also serves as an Archdeacon at an Anglican Church in Australia. He has many written titles on Christian mysticism and spirituality. Now, his recent book is called Escaping from Eden. And that book was hailed by George Noory as this generation's Chariots of the Gods. Now, that is a title. His latest book, Scars of Eden, is endorsed by no other than Erich Von Daniken. Now, how about that? Beyond that, I checked him out on YouTube, and he has a video out there, a short one, a relatively short one. The title is, Was Jesus an Alien? And after listening to that video, it is definitely starting to look in that direction, because he digs into ancient documentations and papers and writings of that time, including the Bible and also other writings that show that there is some mysticism going on here that really cannot be explained by, other Newtonian science, I suppose. And my research also proved what I found in the surviving Roman records. First of all, that he did exist, that cannot be questioned, and that there is some anomalies around the birth and his youth upbringing that can be really interesting to talk about. Now, oh boy, this is going to be good. Now, Noory and I actually had the enjoyment of speaking at a conference, both of us, where Paul was also speaking. And here's a really neat thing. When I look at my watch, it's right now 6 minutes after 5 in the afternoon, West Coast time. If Paul looks at his clock right now, it is 6 minutes after 10 a.m. tomorrow.
Yeah.
So, welcome to the show, my time-traveling friend, Paul.
Welcome, Paul.
Today from the future. Hi,
Yeah.
Argy. Hi, Noory. Thanks so much for having me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, where do we want to start, Paul? You have so much you have written about in your videos and your research and your books. It will at least take us a month and a half to go through a part of that. Where do you want to start?
Well, I think what often intrigues people is how I got to this territory of what we would call paleo-contact. And that's the theory that our ancient ancestors in the deep past had contact with other extraterrestrial civilizations. And people ask about that because my route has been through the world of Christian ministry. 33 years I worked as a church doctor, a theological educator, an archdeacon for the Anglican Church in Australia. And a big part of my work there was training pastors in how to interpret ancient texts, the Bible in particular. And it strikes people as unusual that somebody from that background would come out and say, hey guys, actually, I think the Bible is really all about aliens. I'm not the first person to suggest paleo-contact, but it's unusual for a senior churchman to come out and say, we have been reading these stories as if they're God's stories, but with a little bit of a different translation work done here, drilling down into the root meanings of the words, we reach a layer of the story that really lays bare the extraterrestrial nature of humanity's origins. So that's been my way in. It's been through language and linguistics. My first love was languages. I was very fortunate at school to learn French, German, Latin, went on to learn Italian, Portuguese, New Testament, Greek. And so when I've had the time to go into deeper study and to go to ancient texts, the Bible in particular, I always begin with the question, what do the words mean? And that was really the white rabbit that led me onto this territory, and to sit at the feet of elders of indigenous cultures, curators of ancestral narratives all around the world, and find similar stories embedded there.
Wow. Wow.
Those stories, every culture on the earth have those stories. They have the stories of the flood. They have the stories about the giants. They have the stories about star people that came down and helped them. And I don't think it's possible that they all could have come up with this fictitious idea.
No, that's right. The correlations are really what grabbed my attention. Now, a lot of people sort of noddingly know about these patterns in ancient world mythology, and I certainly did before I got onto the research path for Escaping from Eden. But the way the Bible is translated at the moment, the Bible sort of stands as a counterpart to all of these other ancient stories. The way we translate it is as if the Bible is saying, forget what everybody else is saying. this is what really happened. This is how things really began. But I found when I got into these key words in the biblical texts and asked the simple question, what's the root meaning of these words? When I got to a more, if you like, primitive translation of those words, all the biblical stories do a flip, and suddenly they line up in parallel with all these other ancient texts. And it's not just that they're telling a story that's done the rounds. You know, there was some ancient story got passed on through Chinese whispers across every continent, or some document that got passed around and then retranslated. That's not the nature of these correlations. Very often you've got very different language and metaphor that has been invoked by different cultures, clearly to describe the same visual memory. So our ancestors saw something, and then they found a way of describing what they saw. And now when we read these ancient texts alongside each other in the 21st century, we have a pretty shrewd idea of what they saw. And just one example of that is, I got to the root meaning of the word ruach in the Genesis account of creation. Now, people will be familiar with the conventional translation that in the beginning, the earth was formless and void. It was flooded, shrouded in darkness. And then the Spirit of God, it says, brooded over the waters. Except that that word for spirit, the word ruach, means a thing that creates a vortex of wind, a thing that creates a movement of air, a ruach. And I thought, what happens if we translate it that way? And I realized it was repeating what the ancient Sumerian stories talked about, where creation begins on a flooded planet, and then 4 winds arrive to start clearing the water away to create dry land. Go to the Philippines, they have the story of a giant hawk hovering over the flooded waters, and then with its wings creating vortices of wind to clear the water away from the land. If you go to Nigeria, you will hear the story of Osanabua, the Almighty One above the waters, who descends from the skies above the waters and then begins terraforming and clearing the waters away from the land. So you've got Osanabua descending on a chain. You've got a hawk hovering. You've got this ruach, which is a craft. And we can cross-reference that in the Bible to find out it's a craft that creates vortices of wind. And then in ancient Sumer, we've got the 4 winds. And so that's an example of a visual memory, what our ancestors saw, and then different metaphor and different language being used to pass on through the generations in a very memorable form what our ancestors saw when the others arrived and helped the planet recover from its most recent cataclysm.
Wow.
So we're in at the deep end.
Yeah, I am just so wrapped right now. I can't even formulate a cohesive sentence yet. Amazing.
I'm just thinking here too.
Yeah.
You know, thinking about the hawk hovering above the water. The Sumerian symbol for aircraft is that wing of a huge hawk or a bird. Remember, they have that on a lot of their hieroglyphs or their writings. Is those 2 wings? That is their symbol of craft.
That is very intriguing. And another intriguing link in terms of symbology was pointed out by a very eminent translator of the Bible. He used to produce interlinear translations for the Vatican. I'm talking about Mauro Bellino. And he had a very exacting task in doing the interlinear translations, because what that means is you'll have the text, you'll have the Hebrew text, and then you might have a translation on one side of the page and another translation on the other side of the page. And then underneath each Hebrew word will be a literal root meaning translation of each word, so that anyone with an interlinear Bible like that can sort of see the maths that the translators are doing to get where they do. And you can see why one translation goes here, another goes here, when you look at the root meanings. Well, he was doing that work, and he began asking awkward questions, saying, this clearly means a craft. Can we not translate it that way? And the church authorities said, no, on no account are you to translate it that way. They didn't want anything like a technological grid in the translations. Well, he got into the study of the source texts as well, which is the ancient Mesopotamian ones out of Sumeria, Babylonia, Arcadia, Syria. And he got into how they wrote their language with the glyphs they used. And he came across this word ruach that I mentioned before, Spirit of God in the normal conventional translation, craft, as I believe it should be translated. And he asked the question, if we assume this is a loan word from ancient Sumeria, how would you write ruach in the ancient Sumerian text? And if you want to write ruach in primitive cuneiform, you end up with something that looks like a flying saucer hovering over water. Well, that is the story of the ruach in Genesis. Something in the sky, a craft hovering over water. And he would say, I don't think that's a coincidence. And I would say, I agree with that.
When we talk about the aliens also, there are writings coming from the Middle East speaking of the shining ones. There is also a writing I found coming out of, I think it's either Tibet or India. I'm not so sure, where they talked about the stranger that suddenly showed up among them. He walked into our home and he lit up the room.
Exactly.
Now, how do we explain that?
Go on. Yeah, that's right. There are stories like that correlate, and a whole spectrum of what we would now call close encounter experiences that are reported in different traditions all around the world. And one of the intriguing things about these stories is, what's the purpose of them? Because they're not part of a religious paradigm, if I can put it that way. The
right.
Ancient texts of Sumeria, Babylonia, the Akkadian texts, the Assyrian texts, they are not religious texts there to teach a religion and to get you to do something. That's not their purpose. So what is their purpose? These are the stories that talk about the arrival of the Shining Ones. Or if you listen to the Mohawk, the Mohican people, talk about a time in their deep past when their survival on planet Earth was very uncertain. Something had happened to the climate. Some cataclysm had occurred that had pushed them higher up into mountain country where they did not know how to survive. And then these others arrived from out of nowhere to show them how to survive in this new terrain. That story isn't a religious story, doesn't want you to do anything in response. It is simply a memory that has been curated. And once again, the more you see these patterns in the stories, the more you have to begin to consider that these ancient stories are vehicles of ancestral memory. They don't serve another purpose. These stories don't glorify our ancestors. They often don't glorify the visitors either. There's no moral therefore that flows out of them. And when you see the visual correlations, you begin to think they saw the same thing. These two groups in different parts of the world saw people who, when they walk into a room, fill it with light. These two completely different groups from completely different countries saw people who are incredibly tall with blonde hair and were incredibly beautiful. Patterns like that. These different people groups saw people who looked like insects. These saw people who looked like reptiles. And then you listen to what happened next, and you're going deeper into the story and asking, why are we being told this? And it would simply seem to be, these are the stories of our beginnings. And so often they go back to the arrival of these anomalous people at a time when our survival was hanging in the balance after a cataclysm had devastated the planet. And it's one of those anomalies that sometimes catches the attention of Bible readers, that before any word of creation is spoken, in what we think of as the creation story, apparently the planet already exists flooded, shrouded in darkness, with eyewitnesses to see what happened next. And all that is there before the so-called creation of the sun, moon, and the stars. So that alone ought to take us back to those texts and say, I need to start from scratch and work out what's going on here. And one of the best ways to start from scratch is to peel off all the layers of cultural expectations on those texts and go to the root meanings of the words and reread it that way. And that's when this other story of beginnings really becomes bright and shining clear.
Mm-hmm. Bright and shining. Well, in keeping with this thread, I can't even formulate a great question, but can you speak to Jesus related to Ruwa and yeah.
The story of Jesus, I should say I've been a believer since I was 17. I grew up really in my youth as an atheist. I had been unimpressed as a young child. I remember being about 5 or 6 and spotting how my Church of England school was using religion simply to try to get us to behave.
Yes.
And I really wasn't very impressed with that. And that sort of pushed me in the direction of atheism. But then when I was a teenager, I met some Christians who I could see were onto something. There was something different happening in their lives that was actually quite powerful and quite attractive. And there was things happening in the church scene at that time in the 1980s that showed that it was possible to engage in, I'll give for instance, patterns of healing that seemed to engage levels of energy and principles of life that I had not tapped before. So that caught my attention. And I was thinking, how did they get there? What are they on about? So I started thinking afresh about Jesus. And once I was able to separate the credibility of Jesus from the credibility of religious institutions, see that those are two totally different things, it was easier for me to say, well, actually, I find Jesus quite a compelling character, and I find his teaching makes a lot of sense to me, and I want to follow that and have a go at building my life on that. I made my progress as a believer at the evangelical end of the spectrum that is orthodox, and it tells the story of Jesus as one of total uniqueness. And yet through the research I've done for Escaping from Eden and The Scars of Eden, I've realized that the story of Jesus has some very intriguing parallels with patterns throughout our world story. So if I go to the very beginning of the Jesus story in the Gospel of John, John has this beautiful prologue to his gospel where he says, in the beginning was the Word. And he's referring to Jesus there. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Then the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory as one full of grace and truth. And then through the gospel, we see Jesus wrestling with the great question of life. Can we learn love? Can we do love and consciousness and intelligence as a society of beings with free will? And he speaks into that and demonstrates a way. And then towards the end of the gospel, Jesus speaks to the source, the place that he began from. And he addresses the source as Father, which he does throughout the gospel. And he says, Father, now I am returning to you, back to the glory we enjoyed before the creation of the world. Now, Christians understand that as a unique iteration of the hero's journey, beginning as an aspect of God, then incarnating and having a human experience, and then returning to that cosmic connection. Except is not a unique story. Go 400 years prior and listen to Plato, and he tells the same story of all of us. He says that we are fundamentally conscious beings, and that our consciousness precedes this material life and survives it. And anyone who studies out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences will already have an inkling that our consciousness is not just a symptom of a working body, that it can exist outside of the body. It could be projected elsewhere. It could travel, and it survives the expiration of our bodies. Plato went further, and he said, in the beginning is consciousness. And in fact, the whole material universe proceeded from a unified field of consciousness. Consciousness was the first thing. Of course, quantum today is beginning to hint at that possibility. Newtonian physics sees time as the primordial thing. Post-Einstein, it appears to be light and the properties of light. Quantum is saying no, consciousness is where it's at. Plato said that 2,500 years ago. So in the beginning is this unified field of consciousness. Then it fractalizes into the material universe and into plural consciousness beings. And then, having individuated, our consciousness becomes incarnated in a human experience. And then, after this, our consciousness goes somewhere else. So for Plato, it's the universe's story, and it's the story of all of us. And the story of Jesus, as told by John, slots neatly right into that. And so it raises the possibility that Jesus was the same as all of us, but knew exactly where he'd come from and where he was going. So that's a parallel that caught my attention. And I realized that many of the early church fathers fully understood that parallel and talked quite openly about their belief that we have a pre-existence as conscious beings. And they speculated what our existence as conscious beings might be after this life. They even speculated we might reincarnate on other planets. And this was a thread of early Christianity that was pushed out of mainstream orthodoxy, got buried with the Gnostic Gospels in the Nag Hammadi desert. They were buried for their protection so that future generations could read ideas that had become unfashionable and later forbidden. And there have always been scholars through the ages who've gone back to those texts and reintroduced those ideas into mainstream conversation. So that's one interesting parallel. But another is the whole story of the virgin birth. Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, says that there was something unique about the conception of Jesus, that it was what we would now call an artificial insemination, artificial fertilization. We've got language for it now, in vitro fertilization. And that is how Jesus came to be and why he was so special. Except it's not a unique story. His cousin had exactly the same experience. If you just read earlier in the gospel, his cousin John the Baptist, his mother was past childbearing. She had a close encounter with something, and the pregnancy resulted from that. Mary had a close encounter with something, and the pregnancy resulted from that. And the way those close encounters are described absolutely parallels perhaps the earliest example of it in the Bible, which is Abraham and Sarah, also both past childbearing. They have a close encounter with three Elohim, which is the Hebrew word for sky people out of the Sumerian stories. And it's following that experience that they give birth to Isaac, and the whole story of humanity changes at that point. Now, that's just within the Bible. But if you go to China, listen to the story of the Yellow Emperor or the story of Lao Tzu. And again, anomalous pregnancies resulting from close encounters. The ancient texts, listen to the story of Vipassana Buddha, the 22nd incarnation of the Buddha before Siddhartha Gautama Buddha. That story is very explicit that his mother had an encounter with light, a beam of light shining down on her from an object in space, and that her pregnancy resulted from that. Well, go through the world's canon of art and you'll find that symbology even in the Christian story. And there's a very famous painting by Carlo Crivelli from the Renaissance period depicting Mary wearing an interesting headgear, a UFO in the sky, and a beam of light shining upon her. And that's how Carlo Crivelli told the story of the virgin birth, a rather different version of events than the one in the written texts. And yet it's part of this global pattern that says from time to time, there are pregnancies that run in an unusual way, and the people who result from them are very special and significant people. It's a story that is ages old, and there are women today who have similar experiences, who don't go on to be world famous because they produced a world leader, and who don't go around boasting about the story because they know people won't take them seriously. It's a story that's held very, very closely. But I am learning there are people all around the world who are having anomalous experiences that suggest an ET presence still very interested in the human story and in our progress as a species.
Wow.
You mentioned that Jesus knew where he came from, and I don't know if you said why. I put that in there. If we are of other DNA, other ancestry, why don't we know? Why doesn't that part of us give us that consciousness, that enlightenment? And does that have anything to do with many of us who are having glimpses of memories?
Well, Plato had an answer for that. He believed that we are conscious beings who come into the material universe to have a material experience, and we have a human incarnation to have a human experience, and we are here to learn something. This whole exercise, he says, of consciousness fractalizing into the material universe is because consciousness wants to experience itself. And having been a unified field of consciousness, essentially the question is now, can we do that as a multifaceted cosmos? Can we do consciousness, intelligence, love, harmony as a universe of separate beings exercising free choice? So that's the big learning we're all here to do. We're here to learn it as individuals. Have you learned to love? Have I learned to love? Have I learned to shake off all the things that detract from love and harmony and intelligence? So we're here to learn those things. And Plato believed that because we've come from cosmic consciousness into this individuated experience, essentially every learning that we do will be a remembering. Every time we learn a little bit more about how to live in love, we're actually remembering what that unified field of consciousness really was. But for that to work, we can't have a memory of what went before. We can have hints of it, we can have a feeling for it, and we all have a deep, deep instinct towards love. We all feel the world should be a more just and harmonious place than it is. We feel it very deeply, and it's our struggle as a society and as a planet. But we don't have the memory of it because we are here to do the work of learning. And it would be like turning up with all the answers on the back page of the exercise book and running through that instead of going through the exercise book. And so Plato would suggest it's the way of things, that we're here to learn / remember. If we all came with everything already in our knowledge, there'd be no point to the exercise. And I like that view. But of course, as you're saying, Noory, we do catch glimpses of this cosmic reality. And it was a very interesting experience for the world, I think, in the 1960s, when there was a massive popularization of, let's call them healing botanicals, where you could drink something or smoke something or do something that would suddenly give you a glimpse of another dimension, put you in contact with other dimensional entities, but at the same time give you this incredibly powerful feeling of unity and love with every being on the planet. Yes. And that feeling, it sounds very subjective and, woo-woo, but it had such a powerful effect on that generation that when the governments of the world said, we're sending you to war now, huge numbers said, there's no way we're going to war, because I am one with my Vietnamese brother. I am one with my Korean sister. Why would I want to kill another living being? And it was a huge issue for the governments of the day that we'd suddenly reached a moment where they couldn't marshal populations into mass murder for some private agenda, if I can put it that way. That's how powerful that experience of unity was. And we now, it's just a matter of history, it's now known that there was a move by government to illegalize certain forms of those drugs in order to put a stop to the anti-war movement and in order to put a stop to the civil rights movement.
Yes.
Because they depended on this deep, deep insight that people had gained from these healing botanicals that had put them into the experience of we've suddenly remembered who we really are, and we are really here to love each other, not to kill each other.
Yes. Yes.
Wow. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because there's a lot of money in war, and they had to get these plants out of people's hands so they couldn't use it.
And it is on record, that's not my theory, but the guy who came up with that policy of illegalizing particular drugs under President Nixon has gone on record as saying that's why we did it, because we wanted to stop the civil rights movement and we wanted to stop the anti-war movement.
Boy, oh boy.
Well,
so isn't it incredible? They wanted to take the experience of oneness away, and it is very difficult to govern a united people.
Yeah. I'm kind of the nuts and bolts guy in the room, and let me just revert back to Jesus for a second, because it says right in that big black book that's sitting on the shelf somewhere here, that when he was born, there was this shining light that came over, and that's what I get for not turning the phone off. The light came over and stopped over where they were. Now, I have seen UFOs in the sky that looks like that.
Yes.
That is too much of a coincidence for me. If this is true, that's got to be something to what you're talking about.
Well, there is one of these anomalies that we read, we think, hold on, that doesn't make sense. And then we perhaps don't take the time to drill down into, well, what's really going on then? Because the way we tell that story when it comes to Christmas, and we read those particular scriptures, is that a star moved over the house where the roughly 2-year-old Jesus, I think is when this happened, 2-year-old Jesus was living with his mum and dad, and that the precision with which it hovered over that particular house meant that people who'd traveled could tell which house they should go to meet the family of Jesus. Well, that's not a star.
No.
A star can't hover over a particular house. So again, go to the root meaning of the word, and what we're being told is they followed a light in the sky, and the light moved until it hovered over that house.
Yes.
Now, again, you read that with a 21st century mind, and you say, okay, there are people today who see lights that move anomalously, that move with incredible speed, that can make right angle turns, and that are local enough they can hover over a building. We call them UFOs or UAPs, as we're now being trained to call them. But it's certainly not a star. And so go back and use the root meaning, and we're in the territory of paleo-contact once again.
In fact, in the surviving Roman records, I found a document that says something to the effect that they were talking about the Messiah, the Jewish, the Hebrew Messiah, which means Messiah. And they had another name, Yahshua Beth Halachma, which is Halachma was his dad's name or father's name. They talk about there were no records of him before the age of 5. Now that speaks different than the Bible. So you may not have seen that one, but it is actually is written about it. Topkapi Museum in Istanbul, Turkey has a copy of it. where they talk about this ancient document from, I think it was very early, about the time when Nicaea happened. They wrote that there were no record of this Messiah before he was at the age of 5. That could also mean that he was delivered by that light to the family, or then again, I'm on the fence on this. It could be maybe that he was artificially inseminated, or the baby, an alien baby, was given to his mom. So there are several scenarios there, and I really don't know what to think about it. But what's your thought?
Well, those are all possible, but it's interesting because that goes to a bigger question of how does the church respond to other groups having texts to do with Jesus? So you've given an example there, Argo, which is really interesting. And another that you hinted at earlier was that if you go to India, if you go to Kashmir, if you go to Tibet, you'll find ancient traditions there that relate to a young Jesus in his 20s, living there and studying there. And in Kashmir, there's a tradition there of an older Jesus living there and teaching there after the timeline of the stories we have in the Gospels. Now, one of those intrigues me especially because there is a monastery that has a record, and they keep meticulous records of the history of that monastery. The records go back to the time of Jesus, and in those records are records of a guy called Isa, who lived there, studied under the masters, and what it says about him sounds very intriguingly similar to what we know about Jesus. That monastery won't release those records. It's happy for the world to know that this is part of their story and their tradition, but they don't want to release those records. And my suspicion is they don't want to release them because they really don't want to upset the apple cart, because I think it would be almost offensive for the church, let's say in particular the Roman Catholic Church, which is so supremely organized, to have to concede there's stuff we don't know about Jesus that the Indians know. Because where's your authority and credibility gone the moment you say there's a whole 10 years we know nothing about? You have to go and ask, some Buddhists in India for that part of the story. It's just not going to happen. But what's the problem with that when you think about it? Isn't it all right for the church to say, well, we've run with these documents that we have, and we've always known there was this gap. We weren't sure what Jesus was up to in his 20s, or how he became so enlightened, or where he got some of these ideas from. What's the big deal to say, well, he may have traveled, as many people did in those days, could travel with the merchants around the world. What's the big deal in saying he might have lived in other countries? We know he lived in Egypt for a couple of years. What's the problem with saying he lived in India? But it has to do with controlling the narrative. And in my book, The Scars of Eden, I talk about how strongly authorities hold on to means of thought control, essentially. They need to control the narrative. They need to be the arbiters of what's true and false, whether you're talking about a national government or a religious institution like the Roman Catholic Church. And so it becomes a really wobbly thing for them to say, actually, there's this information over here. Let's sit at the feet of another authority and find out a bit more. I don't have any problem with that.
Wow.
Yeah, many of us don't, but we have a lot of limiting powers that be. So thank you for your work. Oh my goodness. I mean, thank you for what you're doing. And I'm still kind of back in your beginning story. What a fortunate life, that you live to have studied with all of the people that you studied with, and I mean, and the work that you've done to learn the language. So, and that brings me back to, and Jesus is the Word, right? So here we are back to the Word, and you opened with all of these languages that you've learned in order to find the truth, and the truth is within the Word. Yes.
Yes, well, it is for me. There are so many pathways into this. And what I've been amazed as I've got into conversation with people who have engaged with Escaping from Eden and the Scars of Eden is that you can come from so many different start points and find that you're on the same territory and comparing notes on similar discoveries and similar implications for our lives. And so I meet with people who come into the areas we're talking about from the start point of studying diet and what makes human beings thrive and what damages health. I've met other people who've come into it through studying world politics and beginning to recognize patterns that suggest something way beyond the conventional histories that we tell one another. Other people who've come in through neuroscience, who studied things like acquired savant syndrome and realized this speaks to a different story of origins. Archaeology, previous civilizations, paleontology, archaeobiology, people who have been students of the world's great literature and understood that there are actually truths being told in our fiction, and they've drilled down into that. People who studied psychoaffective botanical substances come into it that way. I had an amazing conversation with a friend of mine who went to South America, did a tea ceremony, and it blew his whole theology open. And he very nervously shared with me his story because he thought that might be the end of our friendship, or I might be giving him the drugs helpline number or something like that. But he shared his story, and I said, wow, I am amazed to hear what you're saying, because I've spent the last couple of years deep in Plato, and I've come to exactly the same conclusions you have from your experience. And again, it's those correlations that make us sit open-mouthed as we listen to one another and realize we're on an amazing journey of discovery together.
Yes, yes.
You have studied the UFOs and the extraterrestrial issue very much also, and I just can't help it. I got to touch on the ET and the UFO issue. There is a brigadier general, and Haim Eshed. He's a 30-year chief of the Israeli space security program. He said in an interview, at a covert level, governments have secretly been in contact with an intergalactic federation. What in the world? Now, this is coming from a high-level government official. I really want your take on this.
Thank you for mentioning that, Argy. Yes, Haim Eshed said that just before Christmas. Yes, he was the Brigadier General. 27 years he was in that position as the Space Security Chief of Israel. And on the basis of all that experience, apparently his understanding is that we're in contact with an intergalactic federation, a range of ET demographics, apparently with some stakeholding in Project Earth. Now, what he said is what Dmitry Medvedev said a decade ago, the Russian Prime Minister. He said exactly the same on camera to a journalist who was not expecting him to say that. You can watch it for yourself on YouTube and ask if you think he's joking, because I don't think he's joking. And Vladimir Putin did not go on the TV and distance himself from those comments. He didn't say the minister was incapable or had had a few too many vodkas. It was just put out there and left there. Exactly the same thing Haim Eshed is saying. And, well, before I go to that, listen to Ed Mitchell, the Apollo astronaut, the sixth man to walk on the moon. I'd encourage you, if you're a skeptic regarding UFOs or ET contact in the present day, watch everything you can find of Ed Mitchell and ask if you believe what he's saying. Ask yourself if you're listening to a man of honesty and integrity, because he even while bound by layers of official secrets laws, campaigned for the American government, the US government, to declassify its UFO files so that everyone could know that we're in contact. Yeah. That's what he said openly. He wanted humanity to benefit from the free energy and other technology that is available to us through that contact. And he wanted humanity to take its place at that intergalactic federation as a spacefaring civilization, for us to be at that table and for us to know that we're being represented in that conversation, and that how we are being represented is in the interests of all of us. This is what Ed Mitchell said. So you've got Ed Mitchell, Haim Eshed, Dmitry Medvedev. Then you've got, more recently, Alain Juillet, the former head of French intelligence. Chris Mellon, the former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush. They're all repeating this story about us being in company, having technology that we are exploring, and that this has been happening at covert government levels. Now, I am amazed at how little reaction has come from the general public to these amazing revelations that are out there in the public domain from very authoritative figures. But anyone who reads ancestral narratives and world mythology will hear Haim Eshed say intergalactic federation, and they'll say instantly, well, I knew that because the Sumerians talked about that. Or I knew that because the Bible calls it the Sky Council. Or I knew that because I've read the Greek legends or the Norse legends or the Celtic legends. And what he's saying is a repeat of what our ancestors have been telling us about our place in the cosmos for thousands of years.
Yeah.
And why is Pleiades in the Bible 2 or 3 times, or yes?
Yeah. Why the Pleiades? Why Orion? Why Sirius? These 3 regions of space keep getting repeated in the Bible and in cultures all around the world, seemingly with no contact with each other. They all look to those regions of space when they talk about interventions in the human story. And there's a really intriguing verse in the book of Job, and some scholars believe the book of Job may be the oldest text in the Bible, predating the text even of Genesis. Some believe that it's actually an Arabic book that's migrated its way into the Bible, and then it's been reworked as a God story. Except you try reading it as a God story and you may find you struggle a bit.
Yes.
But there's a verse in that where the central character is being challenged about how powerless he really is. And it says, can you reverse the power dynamics between us and Orion, or us and the Pleiades, or us and Sirius? And it has a colorful, poetic way of asking that question, but that's what it's saying. Reverse the power dynamics with those 3 regions of space. Well, how do you read that? Either it's talking about the seasons and that those regions of space were used to navigate us through the seasons, when to plant, when to harvest, or it's talking about power dynamics. It's talking about the relationship between humanity and the beings from those 3 regions of space. And the moment you read that verse alongside Chinese literature, ancient Mesoamerican literature, African literature, you realize the probability is it's the latter, because they all talk about people coming from those regions of space and tutoring our ancestors in how to live as a civilization on planet Earth.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, gosh. I see now we only have a few minutes left of the show, but I
don't want this to end.
I know. But Paul, talk about your books and what people will find in them and where they can find you, and Amazon or wherever they can go to get your books, because this is something that people need to read. If nothing else, it'll set the stage for the future development of the knowledge of mankind, because there is a beginning and you have it.
Well, Escaping from Eden and The Scars of Eden are really both intended as gateway books. They're books you could give to anybody who has a zero interest in this area or gives it zero credibility. And the books will take that reader from zero to realizing, oh my goodness, there's actually something serious here for me to give my attention to. And they're fun reads as well. They're not heavy, stodgy, they're easy reads. So you can go to Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Kindle, Hive, Book Depository, wherever books are sold, get hold of The Scars of Eden and Escaping from Eden. And if you want to get into conversation with me, because I love dialoguing with my readers, go to the Paul Wallis channel on YouTube. I'm always in the comments in conversation with people. Go to The Fifth Kind TV on YouTube. And you can come to my website, paulanthonywallis.com, Anthony with an H and Wallis, Wallis, paulanthonywallis.com. Many people reach out to me through my website for coaching. Many people do that when they've sort of taken a red pill and suddenly realized they're living in a universe that's different to the one they thought it was. So please feel free to contact me that way. And I love being in conversation with people across that great spectrum.
Oh,
Yeah,
wonderful.
wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have one word down here that we didn't get to talk about it. What about just touching on it? Ancient giants.
Well, ancient giants is really intriguing. It's a subject people find really difficult to talk about in the present day, which is strange because back in the 1800s, you would find newspapers reporting giant finds fairly routinely. And then somehow it's become a taboo. Very significant giant find in 2003 in Iraq when Jörg Fassbinder from the Bavarian University of Antiquities discovered the site. He was 99% sure they discovered the site of Gilgamesh's tomb, a giant, and the opportunity was there to DNA test what they'd found. And I think that's where we're at right now. There have been giant finds that relate to the ancient giant stories of cultures all around the world. What we really want to know is who were they? Were they us? Were they just very tall humans? Or are they a spanner in the works of our stories of origins? The opportunity is there to DNA test what we found, and the challenge is to actually make that happen and to ask authorities, why has that not happened? Why have we not heard any more about Gilgamesh's tomb in the 18 years since it was discovered? Or Queen Puabi in the 100 years since she was discovered? Or the giants of Noble County, all those dug up in North America. Where are they now? Why haven't we explored it? And it's something I do touch on in The Scars of Eden. And in that video was Jesus an Alien, if you want to go and look that up.
Yeah, that's excellent.
I know where I'm going right after this.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Oh, God. Thank you, Paul, for being with us
Thank
for this
you
hour.
so much.
It's
Well,
wonderful.
thank you both. It's been a real pleasure, and I would love to join you again sometime.
Oh, I hope so.
You
Well, that's
definitely
the date.
will.
Yes.
That sounds good.
Thank
Well, I think we're our hour up. So, Noory, any good thoughts at the end of this?
You know what? I would turf it over to Paul. One more question. If you could speak to the whole world and the whole world, I'm stealing this from Augie, and the whole world would listen, what would that be, Paul?
Listen to each other's anomalous stories. Ask the people in your family and in your friendship circle, have you ever experienced something that you're not sure what it was and you still can't explain and it's always bothered you? If we can listen to each other with respect, then I believe stories will begin to emerge in every family and friendship circle that will overturn everything you think you know about the universe we live in, and in a way that's exciting, that speaks to us having far greater potential as human beings and a far more interesting universe to live in than we ever thought.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And you know, in that thought, according to physicist James Gates, we are just ones and zeros because that's what they find deep in the equations of the fabric of space. Boy, isn't that an interesting thought?
Woo. Thank you. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
Augie. Thank you to our amazing chat room. I didn't get to communicate much with you because I was so rapt by our conversation. But I'll go back in and look at our chat and comment. And everybody go to Amazon, The Scars of Eden and Escaping Eden, and I'll meet you there as soon as we say goodbye. See you next week, everybody. Much love to everybody. Thank you, Mac, our great producer. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.